Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395. In a recent lecture, we talked about the place of California in the modern civil rights movement, and we talked about the efforts of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans as part of that history. But there was one group we omitted from that lecture, and that is Native Americans. And that's because I am devoting an entire lecture here to what is often described as Red Power, the efforts of Native Americans in the modern civil rights movement to claim equality in California and broadly in American society. And that's because a signal event in the history of Red Power, the effort of Native Americans in regards to civil rights, took place right here in California in 1969, and that's the occupation of Alcatraz Island. So here in lecture this week, we continue our look at the post-World War II period and the place of Red Power within California and with the larger story of civil rights in this era. In the early 20th century, Native Americans here in California were finally growing in population after a long period of decline. In 1848, the United States acquires California in the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexican War. Soon after, gold is discovered in California, sparking the gold rush. And almost immediately after the discovery of gold, there's this large influx of people, certainly from around the world. People came in the gold rush from Asia, from Europe, from South America. But the majority who come in 1848, 1849, hence the football team in San Francisco, were white American-born citizens. And they come and displace Native Americans, so that by 1850, whites are the majority in California. And so Native Americans suffered in the late 19th century with this large influx of white American settlers who often appropriated Native American land. The U.S. government took a very hostile, aggressive attitude towards Native Americans here in California in the late 1800s. But in the early 20th century, Native Americans begin to rebound, their population grows, and Native Americans came to California from other states, helping us see this population growth. It wasn't just natural increase among the Native Americans here within California. It was also the way in which California, as we've seen over the course of this class, was a magnet for migrants from around the nation. We read about in the Arellano book the number of different people who come to Orange County in the 20th century. Well, Native Americans also came to California because California was a center of economic growth, major industries here, and Native Americans are part of that larger history. So the Native American population in California is growing, one, through natural increase, the ways in which Native Americans here within California were growing in population and also thriving in the various industries that shaped California in the early 20th century, agriculture, aviation, oil, all the different industries that were pivotal to California's rise in the early 20th century. And then because of that, Native Americans in other parts of the country came to California chasing their own vision of the California dream. In 1924, on a federal level, the U.S. government finally granted Native Americans citizenship. Prior to 1924, Native Americans were not considered American citizens. They were considered citizens of their respective tribes, which were treated under law as separate nations. But in 1924, Native Americans were granted federal citizenship. They were finally recognized as citizens of the United States. And in the years and decades that followed, there was an effort to redress a lot of wrongs, a lot of injustices that had been established in the late 1800s, in the period we began talking about in this slide, where Native Americans were subject to discrimination, where they were dispossessed of their land. So in the early 20th century, there's this effort after citizenship to try to redress a lot of the wrongs of the late 1800s. In 1928, California tried to redress a lot of the dispossession of land and resources by Native Americans by the state and corporations operating within the state that occurred in the late 1800s. And so their idea was to offer some sort of financial compensation for that dispossession of land and the stripping of key resources. But what happens is that they base it off the census, a special census conducted by California in 1928, which could only find 24,000 living descendants of the original Californian Indians at statehood when California was admitted to the Union as a state in 1850. So ultimately, very few Native Americans here within California were eligible for the compensation because it was based on an effort conducted in 1928 to try to find the direct descendants of Native Americans who were here in 1850, rather than compensate Native Americans who were alive in California in 1928. So a special census was done, but it wasn't a census counting every person who we might describe as of indigenous background or descent, someone who we might describe as Native American. It was this effort to document the people who were the living descendants of the California Indians who were here in 1850. Well, the problem with that is there was so little documentation from that period. You had to have some sort of documentation going back to the Mexican period when California was part of Mexico that could prove that today in 1928 you were a living descendant. And so ultimately very few people were eligible, and the only compensation they received was $200. So this is demonstrative of the very pathetic and inadequate effort after citizenship in 1924 to try to address what had occurred in California and so many states, particularly in the West in the late 1800s, when Native Americans were forced off their land onto reservations, when there was this effort to strip them of their culture, identity. California is part of that larger shameful history of the late 1800s, late 19th century, when Native Americans were subject to such abuses, such dispossession of their property, land, and resources. And then in the 1920s, when there is an effort in California, after federal citizenship is granted to Native Americans, to try to revisit those past wrongs, redress those inequities, it amounts to $200. And very few Native Americans here in California eligible for that compensation. After World War II, as we talked about, California is in the forefront of civil rights. You have the Mendez decision. You have the California Civil Rights Act. We talked about in a recent lecture the way in which California is in the vanguard of major changes that will later take root around the United States. In 1945, the California State Legislature sought to end legal discrimination against Native Americans and passed laws that abolished legal distinctions between Native Americans and other citizens of the state, meaning that Native Americans were not to be discriminated against in terms of their access to public education and other state services, recognizing them as Californian citizens of this nation and stripping away a lot of the laws that had been established in the late 1800s, deepened in the early 1900s in the progressive era, that discriminated against Native Americans. This was an effort to integrate them into the modern California experience, just as we were ending discrimination against Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans in the same civil rights period. But you may change those laws, you may reverse legally discrimination, but you cannot wipe away the consequences of decades of discrimination, decades of efforts to deny Native Americans access to education and the avenues that allow people to generate wealth. So Native Americans in the post-World War II period really continued to feel the consequences of decades of discrimination. They remained economically depressed with high unemployment rates, with low capital and wealth rates of accumulation, a very low median annual income here in California in the 1960s of little over $2,000. Native Americans continue to suffer from difficulties associated with the legacy of a lack of education and access to quality public schools, particularly in rural parts of California. Poverty, undereducation, and other pernicious consequences of discrimination were particularly acute. High dropout rates within high schools. More than 40% of rural Native Americans here in California had not graduated beyond the 8th grade. So it's the post-World War II period. It's a period broadly of civil rights. California is in the vanguard of that effort. It's taking action to roll back a number of discriminatory policies that affected not only Native Americans but many racial minorities. But though we may change the law, though we may change the strictures that have been on the books for decades, you can't overnight reverse the consequences of those strictures and laws over the decades, meaning that Native Americans may now be citizens and they may no longer be subject to discrimination in employment, in education, but they continue to suffer the consequences of discriminatory exclusionary policies with high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, undereducated overall, often because they were relocated to reservations in rural areas where economic opportunities were limited. And so in the era of civil rights, you have this contrast between what's happening in the law and what's happening in reality, the way in which Native Americans were still plagued by the consequences of long-standing efforts of discrimination. And then compounding that is that a lot of the key cultural institutions here in California in the post-World War II period were still locked in that mindset and mentality of the earlier period of discrimination. We talked about Frontierland in Disneyland and the way in which it represents Native Americans as locked in the past, in the grips of stereotypes of either the tomahawk-wielding savage or the noble savage, the pacified and conquered Native American. So Disneyland, a key cultural institution emanating out of California, continues to represent Native Americans as locked in the past and locked into certain pernicious stereotypes. Other cultural institutions here in California also perpetuated racism, stereotypes. Hollywood continued to make films in the post-World War II period, in the civil rights era. Westerns, it is an era of Westerns where Westerns are very popular in the post-World War II period, tapping into Cold War sympathies and the martial militaristic elements of the Cold War, tapping into a period of gender flux with its ideals about femininity and masculinity. Westerns are very popular in this period because they represented a certain ideal of masculinity and femininity that was prized in the conformist post-World War II era of suburbanization. So the post-World War II period is a period of civil rights, but it's also a period where Hollywood is making many Westerns, and those Westerns, of course, are set in the past. And in that sense, they fail to account for the modern and contemporary experience of Native Americans. It's very rare to see Native Americans represented in popular culture as people alive in the present, and contemporary Californians, making it hard for us to imagine them as Californians. There's a moment to again think about one of the key themes in this class. Who do we imagine as one of us? It was hard to imagine Native Americans as Californians in the 50s and 60s because they were represented in Disneyland and Hollywood as people locked in the past. And then, of course, along with that, they were represented as the foe, the enemy, the savages who are attacking John Wayne and the other intrepid masculine heroes of this period. So film and television also very popular on television. 1950s Westerns are very popular. Another cultural institution here in California, as the studios, TV studios in Burbank crank out these Westerns so popular in this period that also represent Native Americans in a way that perpetuates racism and stereotypes and seems to fail to account for Native Americans as part of us, as part of a modern post-World War II California. So another problem plaguing Native Americans in the post-World War II period, despite civil rights, despite these efforts to roll back discrimination, is the way in which they were still in many ways captive to stereotypes in a popular cultural industry located right here in California. And so all this leads to the advent of what's described as the Red Power movement. This is the Native American civil rights efforts. So the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, as we documented in a recent lecture, is this era of civil rights. And you have Black Power, the efforts of African Americans. You have Brown Power, the efforts of Latinos. And also you have Red Power, the advocacy of Native Americans for civil rights to be full and equal members of the state and of this nation. The Red Power movement was seeking to redress past wrongs, to revisit treaties and restore land rights and resources to Native Americans. It was a great racial reckoning where the nation was to be confronted with that past and the consequences of racism and discrimination. And it was also an effort to imagine Native Americans not as locked in the past, not as savage, tomahawk-wielding images from Westerns, but members of the contemporary modern California experience. And so the Red Power movement began, and it was particularly focused on economic concerns, namely restoring land rights, resources, to Native Americans who had lost those resources in the late 1800s, in that period where California became majority white, where there's this large influx of outsiders coming to California, where California was often ballyhooed and represented as the nation's white spot. We talked about that in the Progressive era. And as a result, Native Americans lost their land, they lost their resources, they were subject to a great deal of discrimination. The Red Power movement was in particular dedicated to restoring those resources, self-determination, empowering Native Americans, granting them greater economic freedom. The key Native American advocacy group nationwide, this is on a nationwide level, in the 1960s was AIM, A-I-M, which stood for the American Indian Movement. And it advocated for civil rights for Native Americans across the United States, and in particular emphasized this idea of restoring economic resources, land, access to watersheds, the elements of economic liberty that would be necessary to Native Americans finally being able to vault out of poverty and into a more equitable status in California and in America. Now, the Red Power movement advocated for Native Americans. It emphasized the Native American experience, this long history of discrimination. It spoke to very specific grievances among Native Americans, including, most prominently, this restoration of land rights and resources, this revisitation of treaties. But it shared a lot of similarities with the other civil rights efforts of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos in the way in which it called for equality. It demanded a great racial reckoning where we had to confront our past, where it emphasized cultural pride, that being of color is not secondary or degraded, that the history of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans is valuable and part of America, that racial pride should prevail among people who have long been maligned and told that they are backward or regressive. And in addition to those commonalities that Red Power shared with other civil rights movements, it employed similar strategies, sit-ins, boycotts, protests, the very methodologies that were employed by African Americans and Asian Americans and Latinos. Cesar Chavez launched a boycott. One of the most signal key events in the history of the United States in the post-World War II period is the Montgomery bus boycott, where after Rosa Parks' arrest in 1955, African Americans refused to patronize a public transportation system that does not serve the public, it segregates the public. So one key strategy to civil rights staged and waged on a national level was this employ of boycotts. We saw that here in California with Chavez, and it's certainly key to a variety of efforts by different racial minorities in this period. And Native Americans, seeing the efficacy of boycotts, also employed them as part of their strategy of economic empowerment. Don't buy where you can't work. Why patronize a business that won't hire Native Americans? They also stage sit-ins and protests, efforts to build awareness of these past wrongs as they made their arguments for greater inclusion. So it is a moment of dramatic change, and California is a key part of that larger drama and story of the United States awash in these forces of change, where the nation is forced to confront its past, where California is forced to confront its past, where a variety of groups, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, are engaged in this activism. But the most important action of activism in the entirety of the Red Power movement took place here in California in 1969, when an offshoot of AIM, a group known as the Indians of all tribes, began their occupation, or as they would say, reoccupation, of Alcatraz Island, the famed island right off the coast of San Francisco. Now, when we think of Alcatraz today, we tend to think of it as the home of a prison. And yes, in the early to mid 20th century, Alcatraz Island, that island right off the coast of San Francisco, was the home of a federal prison where notorious criminals like Al Capone were housed. But in 1969, the prison had long closed. The prisoners at Alcatraz had been relocated to other California federal prisons like San Quentin. So in 1969, the island was largely unoccupied. It was in a transition period to becoming what it eventually will be and is today, a national park. So in 1969, when this group of Native American activists, the Indians of all tribes, an offshoot of AIM, occupied Alcatraz, it wasn't still a prison, and it hadn't yet become a national park. And this was key to their argument and the meanings associated with the occupation of Alcatraz, as we'll talk about in just a moment, that they were occupying, or in their mind, reoccupying land that was there for the taking. The Indians of all tribes was composed of young Native American activists, many of them college students from the Bay Area, many of them intense and committed civil rights activists, many of them advocates not only for Native American rights, but also the broader social movements of this period, opposed to the war in Vietnam, supportive of feminism, civil rights more broadly. So they were young activists in this period of the 1960s, where young college students were often very active in a variety of social concerns, protesting the war in Vietnam, supporting the efforts of American women in the modern feminist movement, supportive of sexual minorities, because 1969 is also the year of the Stonewall Rebellion, a key event in New York City that's often seen as the beginnings of the modern gay rights movement. So the Indians of all tribes were very active in a variety of causes, but they are also descendants of Native Americans who were forcibly relocated to San Francisco after World War II. After World War II, in the Cold War, in a moment where Americans were told to unite, in a period that in American popular culture, we are told all is right in America, that America is this bastion of freedom and democracy as we confronted the Soviet Union. There's a great emphasis on consensus, on conformity, of everyone being the same, united in America. And as a result, the Truman administration, the presidential administration of the late 40s, early 50s, immediately after World War II, and the Eisenhower administration, the administration in the 1950s, had a program designed to urge Native Americans off the reservation and into urban areas where they would assimilate into mainstream white America. And part of that involved forcible relocation, where the federal government relocated Native Americans off the reservations and into urban areas where they would assimilate into mainstream white society as part of that consensus, we're all American, ethic and rhetoric of the Cold War and the early post-war period. So Native Americans were removed from reservations and brought to urban areas like San Francisco, where they were encouraged to divest themselves of their Native American languages, religiosity, culture, and be more like mainstream Americans, live in the suburbs, stare at TV, and we're all the same. The young activists who would occupy Alcatraz in 1969 were descendants of that program. Their parents had been forcibly relocated to the Bay Area. That's why they're living in that area. And so they saw in their parents' experiences hostility towards Native American culture, this idea that it was debased and backward. And so they saw that in their parents' experience, and it really sharpened their commitment to racial pride, the celebration of Native American identity that was at the heart of Red Power. So in 1969, the Indians of all tribes occupy Alcatraz. Again, it was in this period of transition from a functional federal prison to later a national park. And because it was largely unoccupied, their argument was, well, no one's using it. It's ours now. That this area is ours by right of discovery. And this was a very clever argument because it was a way of forcing America to confront its past, namely the past of dispossession of Native Americans. Because when Europeans arrived after 1492 and established colonies, this was the argument they made. Well, no one's using this land, ignoring the rights of Native Americans, seeing Native Americans as unworthy occupants of the land. So European colonization, the process by which European powers like the English came to colonize North America, was all predicated on this idea that we have a claim to this land, that Native Americans living upon this land aren't using it, and so it's ours by right of discovery. So using this argument, the Indians of all tribes say, Alcatraz is ours. Nobody's using it. It's ours. And it's a very clever argument because it forced, therefore, Americans to be cognizant of the way in which that same argument had been used for centuries to dispossess Native Americans. Also, before the Spanish colonized California, the island of Alcatraz was occupied by Native Americans. They lived in that part of California like they lived in all parts of California. So that's why they were saying they were reoccupying what was always Native American land. The occupation begins in November of 1969. The Indians of all tribes arrive on Alcatraz Island. The U.S. Coast Guard attempted to stop them and will establish a blockade, making it difficult for them to come back to the mainland to resupply. Initially, only 14 members of the Indians of all tribes occupy, but a lot of attention came to this movement and attracted a lot of attention, and therefore many others would attempt to come and also occupy Alcatraz. So though the initial effort to occupy was limited to just 14 because of the efforts of the U.S. government to stop this through the Coast Guard, it became such a sensation that later many others will come and live with the Native American protesters, and the occupation will continue until 1971, so almost 2 years later. The attention that came to the Indians of all tribes that drew other people to join with them in solidarity and sympathy came from their protests on Alcatraz, where they raised awareness of, again, that history of dispossession, that history of prejudice, that history that Native Americans were subject to in California and around the nation. The Indians of all tribes said, we're not going to leave until Alcatraz is in many ways restored to Native Americans by now, rather than turning it into a national park for tourists to come and pose next to jail cells and buy tchotchkes and souvenirs in a gift shop. Let's instead dedicate it to Native American history, put a museum on Alcatraz dedicated to the Native American experience. Let's not turn this into yet another possession of the federal government that allows them to erect a national park that omits the way in which Alcatraz Island and so much of North America was once Native American land and a place where Native Americans created societies, cultures that were still consequential in California in 1969. So the Indians of all tribes had a goal, and their goal was to prevent Alcatraz from becoming a national park, transferring again this land anew to the federal government. Instead, let's use it to celebrate the original descendants, the original occupants of Alcatraz Island, Native Americans, and in doing so raise awareness of Native American history, Native American culture, the history of California before Europeans, before the U.S. period. So though the occupation began with just a few activists, it would become this flashpoint that would capture the attention of so many Americans. And that's really the significance of the occupation of Alcatraz, how it became this flashpoint that allowed Americans in California and far away from California to really think about the experience of Native Americans. So eventually, hundreds of activists would come and participate in this occupation. It became a huge media sensation. It attracted celebrities. And so it became this moment for the United States to think about the experience of Native Americans in the past, as the occupation was so, as we noted earlier, freighted with ideas about the past and arguments that had been previously employed to justify the dispossession of Native Americans. It was also a moment to think about Native Americans in the present as part of America in the civil rights era. So the occupation of Alcatraz becomes the signature event in the Red Power movement. And so once again, all eyes are in California. Once again, we see, as we have so often in this class, how the nation is looking to California in this period now as the epicenter of this Red Power movement. The Native Americans who occupied Alcatraz and those sympathizers who joined with them created a whole community on Alcatraz. Again, their idea was, this is ours now. This is our land. We're claiming it back after it had been taken away from us. And so they occupied with this idea that they were there to now occupy the island until their demands were met. And they created a whole community with a daily newsletter printed and distributed among the hundreds who would at times be present on the island. They had a daily radio broadcast. This attracted a great deal of attention, and so many celebrities who were sympathetic to the Indians of all tribes traveled to Alcatraz and stayed among them, including Jane Fonda, the noted anti-Vietnam activist, Marlon Brando, Anthony Quinn, the African-American activist, Dick Gregory. The rock group, Creedence Clearwater Revival, was so sympathetic to the Indians of all tribes that they donated a boat that they purchased so that members of the occupation could come and go back and forth. They needed to go back to meet some personal obligations or to resupply. It was a very, very dangerous and fraught effort, not only to sail from the island back to San Francisco, but of course, there are all these efforts to capture them because the federal government declared this an illegal occupation, ironically. And so the Coast Guard continued to try to intercept vehicles, boats that would go back and forth. And so this is sort of an act of defiance, almost an act of civil disobedience, where the rock group Creedence Clearwater Revival are trying to aid the activists in that effort. So you have the occupation of Alcatraz, which becomes this huge media sensation, attracts a great deal of attention for good and for bad. One, for good, in drawing attention to their activism and efforts, but also attracting a great deal of rebuke and scorn. It's California, it's 1960s, and in the last two lectures we've talked about how California 1960s is the epicenter of two social movements, often in collision with each other, civil rights and conservatism. It is the state of the occupation of Alcatraz. It is the state of so many key events within the modern civil rights movement. It is the state where Cesar Chavez is leading his campaign. But it's also the state that would elect Ronald Reagan governor in the same moment, 1966. It's the state that gave you Richard Nixon, who was elected president of the United States in 1968. Sworn in 1969, the same year of the occupation of Alcatraz. So another way in which this occupation is such a flashpoint is it reveals this California awash in two very different social movements. So while the occupation is going on, it's receiving a great deal of criticism from prominent conservatives here within California. Governor Reagan, President Nixon, a number of key conservative politicians and activists mine this event not to express sympathy and support, but to express rebuke, criticism, and scorn. The occupation finally ends in 1971 after beginning in late 1969 when Nixon and Governor Reagan finally fulfill their threats to cut off electricity and water to the island in an effort to end what still remained as the occupation. And so this becomes the action taken by the government to end the occupation by depriving those on the island of basic needs like water and electricity. But also another factor is that by 1971, a lot of the early enthusiasm, a lot of the early support had died down. The passion and sentiment that was expressed by many sympathetic to the Red Power movement had ebbed. It was no longer this focus of celebrities who would help to buoy and bolster that enthusiasm and attention. So the public attention had waned, spirit had ebbed, and so in May of 1971, with the withdrawal of key support services like water and power, the occupation ended. But it went on for over a year, from late 1969 until May of 1971, and it became this very important event that urged Americans to think about the Native American experience. So eventually in 1971, the occupation ends after 19 months, but in the aftermath of the occupation, there would be a wave of other acts of civil disobedience that came out of how this event helped to spark greater interest, recognition, and support for. Here are a couple images from the occupation. The Indians of all tribes, the activists who occupied Alcatraz, often spray painted slogans on buildings, some of the old prison buildings on Alcatraz, because this attracted so much attention and because they were photographed. This was a way of getting their message out by spray painting these messages. And you could see you are on Indian land on the left, the core argument of the Indians of all tribes that this was once, like all parts of California and all parts of North America, the land of Native Americans, but through the course of European colonization and then later the efforts of the United States, they had been deprived of that land. Remember, we talked about how crucial to the Red Power movement was this idea of redress, restoring land rights to people who had lost land over the centuries. And then on the right, more spray paint expressing this sense of welcome for indigenous people. Now, today, now in the 21st century, these statements, this spray painting is still there in Alcatraz. If you go to Alcatraz today, it is now a national park. And there's a lot of attention, of course, to the history of Alcatraz as the home of that federal prison. And you can indeed go in and lock yourself in one of the cells and do all those touristy things and buy things in the gift shop. But when it became a national park after the occupation, they integrated this part of Alcatraz's history, the occupation, which was now part of the history of Alcatraz, into the national park. And there are exhibits on display at Alcatraz about not just the occupation and its place within civil rights, but also the longer history of Native Americans on Alcatraz and in California. So in that sense, the occupiers are very successful. They changed the history of California, and they also changed the way in which that history would be presented in what now is a national park on Alcatraz. So as we speak, there are visitors to Alcatraz who are learning more about the history of Native Americans thanks to this occupation. One of the other consequences, one of the other layers of significance of the occupation was the way in which it did provoke other acts of civil disobedience and help to fuel and foster the Red Power movement. here in California and around the nation. In 1970, Native American activists in Boston on Thanksgiving Day occupied the Mayflower II, a replica of the ship that Pilgrims took as part of the English colonization of North America in the 1620s. So everyone's very familiar with the origin myth, and it is a myth, of America, the arrival of the Pilgrims, and the story of the first Thanksgiving. For Native Americans, the arrival of Europeans isn't something to celebrate. It's really the beginning of that effort to war against them, unleash pathogens, which had a huge impact in decimating the Native American population, and dispossess them of their land. So they made a statement in 1970, why are we celebrating this? This is not something that our people, we as Americans too, look to as a part of our great glorious past. They occupied Mount Rushmore in 1971. Now, the land that monument, Mount Rushmore, is built upon was once a Native American reservation. In the late 19th century, as there's this effort to force Native Americans onto reservations to make way for mining, ranching, railroad construction, all the industry shaping the West in the late 19th century, Native Americans were forcibly relocated to what is now the Mount Rushmore site. But then gold was discovered in that region, and Native Americans who had been forced onto that land and were promised that land were then removed from that reservation so that gold could be extracted by mining corporations. And then when that was ended, we built a great monument to democracy on that land, the monument of Mount Rushmore representing those different American presidents. So Native Americans see this in a very different way. This isn't a monument to democracy. It's testimony to the lack of democracy, the lack of equality, the lack of freedom. Mount Rushmore means something very different to Native Americans. It's this legacy of lies, dispossession, and a very undemocratic nation. And so there was a great occupation at Mount Rushmore in 1971, inspired by what was taking place at that same moment in California at Alcatraz. Another act of civil disobedience and defiance at Wounded Knee in 1973. Another act of occupation where the Aglala tribe occupied what was once the scene of a massacre in 1890 where U.S. troops fired upon Native Americans in an event that was often considered the last major confrontation between the U.S. Army and Native Americans in the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s, ending those conflicts with the massacre at Wounded Knee. So all of these central, signal, seminal spaces in American history, Native American history, the story of the arrival of the Pilgrims, and with it a larger story of European colonization, Mount Rushmore, which was once Indian land, then taken from them, Wounded Knee, the site of this terrible massacre in 1890. All of these sites in the early 70s became sites of protests. And that draws right on the model of what we see in California in Alcatraz. Here in California, as a result of great activism that the occupation represented and the great wave of support and campaigns that followed, there were efforts in the 1970s to again revisit old treaties and restore land rights to Native Americans. The Achu-Maui tribe protested in this effort, an attempt to regain lands that had once been part of their tribal possessions that had been taken away by the state of California and transferred to a private corporation, PG&E, in the 1920s. In the 1970s, inspired by this wave of red power and activism, they staged a protest. The Yurok Indians in northeastern California also protested, lobbied, engaged in acts of advocacy and activism to also try to win back access to key resources, watershed rights, and this led to many clashes with police departments and government in the region. So it's really a period of a hotbed of activism around the country and in California as well in the aftermath of the occupation. So the occupation of Alcatraz ends in 1971, but red power doesn't end. And the momentum and efforts and energy behind these protests is so strong that the Nixon administration, our old friend Richard Nixon, Yorba Linda's own, has to bend to the demands of Native Americans and embraces a policy that's designed to restore a lot of land, resources, watersheds to Native Americans in the spirit of what drove AIM and the broader Red Power movement, self-determination. Remember, as we said earlier, the Red Power movement, Native American advocacy, was very much dedicated to empowering Native Americans, self-determination, something that could be facilitated through restoration of resources and rights that had been taken away from Native Americans. It was about economic freedom. And this is another similarity between Red Power and the other civil rights efforts. Remember, Cesar Chavez wanted to unionize Latino and Asian American farm workers so that they could enjoy a higher standard of living, higher wages, better working conditions. It was about jobs. It was about economics. The same is absolutely true about African Americans. They want housing. They want the key marker of material success, middle class life in California. That's why they were so committed to overturning residential discrimination. So civil rights is very much about jobs, the economy, and that's true for Native Americans too. They wanted restoration of land rights so that they could be free citizens in the most important way, with economic self-determination. So the occupation of Alcatraz helped to spark a number of protests, sit-ins all around the country. It helped to motivate and push and compel the Nixon administration, Nixon who had been such an intense critic of the occupation, to adopt this policy that would revisit treaties, restore rights, the self-determination movement. But one of the more troubling consequences of all this interest in Native Americans and the greater visibility of Native Americans, the Red Power movement, was the way in which it was reduced in many ways in our popular culture, in a movement known as Indian chic, where all of a sudden it becomes cool to dress like a Native American. It becomes cool to claim Native American heritage. So celebrities like Cher and others are out there wearing their hair in braids and bragging about their Cherokee heritage or whatever Native American tribe they would claim. And this is very troubling because it's so reductive. It's taking this civil rights crusade and turning it into consumerism, materialism, celebrity culture. There are many best-selling books in the early 70s that represented Native Americans in what was hoped to be a more positive light, but often, again, reduced them to stereotypes of the noble savage. Many Hollywood movies now try to reverse course and offer a more sympathetic representation of Native Americans, but they still represented Native Americans in line with stereotypes that they might imagine are more positive, but were still stereotypes. And a lot of those films continued to be about the past. There's very few films about Native Americans living in the 1970s, though they were, of course, yet another community here in California. And Hollywood still seems to lock them in the past in the way that we talked about earlier. There were many songs about Native Americans and Native American rock groups. And what that did was it tended to depoliticize Red Power, turn it into a commodity, a style, something you could wear without really the meat of the political message behind it. And so pop culture, consumer culture, often takes things that are transgressive, challenging to the social order, and co-opt them and use them to make money. And that happened in the 1970s with the greater visibility of Native Americans. As I mentioned earlier, one other legacy of the occupation is how it changed how we represent the history of California and the history of Alcatraz Island in the national park that's eventually opened when the occupation ends. When the occupation ends, the process can go forward. And today, Alcatraz is a national park. It's one of the many tourist attractions in and around San Francisco. But when you go there, you get a good lesson in not just Native American history, Native American life, but also this particular aspect of Native American history, the occupation of Alcatraz. So the graffiti's still there, the spray paint slogans are still there, and there's this whole multimedia exhibit about the Indians of all tribes and what they did on Alcatraz Island and why it was so significant and important to California history and American history. In the 80s and 90s and the late 20th century, as a result of Red Power, civil rights, and all that developed in the 60s and 70s, there's this effort to revise school curriculum and include greater coverage in K through 12 education, university education, in the CSU and UC system, Native American history, the contributions of Native Americans. This too was again one of the major thrusts of Red Power. We're Americans too, and we have contributed to this nation's history. Native Americans have fought in every war in our nation's history, from the Revolution through, in the 70s, the Vietnam War, and today the war in Afghanistan. So they are Americans, their story is our story, and that was key to the arguments of Native American activists. We're not, locked in the past. We're not artifacts on display in Disneyland. We're Americans, we're still here, and we're still key contributors to the history of this nation and certainly here in California. And that was recognized in revision of textbooks, state-mandated requirements in California state schools to teach Native American history. You see that today in the way in which here in the state of California we've renamed Columbus Day Indigenous Persons Day. So this too is part of the aftermath of Red Power. In the late 20th and early 20th century, the greater visibility of Native Americans in California politics manifest in Indian gaming, and in particular propositions designed to liberalize Indian gaming. California, going back to the Progressive era, had very strict prohibitions on gambling, but those began to erode in the 80s. One, due to the advent of the California lottery. One of the strategies that California employed when Prop 13 passed, and we talked about Prop 13 last week, and it led to declining revenues with a reduction in property taxes, was to try to raise revenue through a lottery. And so in the 80s, California is able to shed some of its progressive legacy, which was so critical of license and sin, by adopting a lottery. And maybe that naturalized gambling in a way that also opened the door to establishing gambling casinos on Native American reservations. In 2008, there were a series of propositions on the California ballot, 94, 95, 96, 97, all of which were geared towards liberalizing Indian gaming, and they all passed overwhelmingly. So in the late 20th and now early 21st century, Californians have embraced Indian gaming for a number of reasons. One, we wanted to gamble, and we didn't want to drive all the way to Las Vegas. So having these casinos within the state has satisfied a demand within California for gambling. When we didn't have casinos prior to this, we had to go to Vegas. And now you have a number of gaming sites throughout California. Also, gambling becomes more popular in a time of the acute economic crisis in the nation, in California. We talked a little bit about that last week in regards to why Prop 13 passed. We'll talk more about that in lectures to come, including next week, what's going on in the California economy late 20th century that is urging a lot of people to look to gambling as a way to continue to live the California dream. But also, those were sources of revenue, that they'd be taxed. Part of the popularity of the propositions that passed in 2008 was that, well, we can tax gaming and it'll generate revenue to help fund education and all the other things that the state needs to fund when it's lost so much revenue from Prop 13. So California taxpayers like the idea of gambling as a source of revenue for the state in lieu of higher income taxes or property taxes. And then there was also this idea that, well, we're helping Native Americans. We're helping them gain economic power after so long of discrimination. It was sort of a form of redress. It was another kind of act of restoration. By allowing Native Americans to operate casinos, they could have greater economic autonomy. So all these factors help explain why California has really embraced Indian gaming. But there's been a number of consequences to that. The tribes that do get casinos have thrived. But what about those who do not? It's led to this sort of conflict between different Native American tribes. where they all want a casino, but they can't all have a casino. So when one secures a casino, they benefit, but those who are denied casinos do not. If you have a casino, you don't want other tribes to get one because that's competition. So it's pitted Native Americans against each other. It's created a cleavage between the haves and have-nots, Native Americans who do have casinos and benefit, and those who do not. Because Indian gaming becomes so prevalent and popular, there's this misconception in California, well, they all have casinos now, so they're all doing well. We don't have to worry about Native Americans anymore. They're all rich, right? They all have casinos. That's just not true because there are so few tribes that have casinos. And so another one of the consequences of the way in which in the late 20th and early 21st century Native Americans now become associated with gaming is that too many non-Indigenous, non-Native American Californians just assume, well, they're fine now and they don't need relief or help, and we've redressed all these wrongs. So there are many Native Americans who continue to be subject to the consequences of centuries, decades in the American period of discrimination, high unemployment, high infant mortality, a lack of access to quality education. And we're often unable to address that because there's this misconception, well, they're all rich, they all have casinos. So the advent of Indian gaming in California in the late 20th, early 21st century has been a mixed blessing. It's been good for the Native American tribes that have such casinos, but one, it represents a state that's so desperate for any sort of tax revenue that's willing to legalize gaming. But also, it's led to a lot of misunderstanding about the Native American experience and an inability to see what the Indians of all tribes, AIM, and so many Native American advocates were trying to get us to see: the plight, the experience, the hardships of Native Americans in California.